Hey there, my name is Jackson and welcome to another book review. This is where I read a book and make this video to give my thoughts, opinions, perspectives on the book and the author's thoughts, and hopefully you can take some value from it, or maybe you'll be interested in reading the book after I talk about it. So here we go. Today I'm talking about this book, Abolish Silicon Valley. Similar to the last book, it focuses on the tech world. I guess that's just my kick these days. So right off the bat, this title, Abolish Silicon Valley, is a little bit clickbaity and extreme. So I'm curious to see how the author is able to justify. So the author's name is Wendy Liu. I'm not going to talk about her background because actually a lot of this book is about her story. So we'll kind of get into it naturally. So this book is a mix of Wendy's personal story and then her thoughts on the tech industry and general issues as a whole. So we start when she's younger and has an interest in coding and technology. She seems like she really got into it organically, was part of basically open source kind of tech forums and being a part of discussions in that at a young age, I believe as a teenager. And then she always saw Silicon Valley as a place that was helping the world, a meritocracy. And in retrospect, she talks about how that perspective was rose-colored by her ambition. This all brings her to end up at an internship at Google eventually when she's a little bit older. So in this internship, she talks about the culture at Google, which sounded vaguely cult-like in a way. They would have big meetings with everybody in the company in these beautiful offices in San Francisco, where the founders would talk to people and be making jokes, and they'd use all these kind of terms like Googler and things like that to describe themselves. Surprisingly, the internship didn't seem as intense as you might expect from a Google internship. They seemed to treat the interns very well and spend a lot of money on them in terms of giving them gifts, basically, putting on events for them, kayaking trips, things like that. So Wendy had worked on projects before this in technology, and it seemed like she wasn't as fulfilled by the work in her Google internship and felt that it wasn't very impactful and she didn't feel like she was doing much. And at the same time, she starts to talk about how she's noticing a little bit at this point the poverty discrepancy in San Francisco. You have these beautiful offices at Google, and then you have homeless people on the street, everywhere as well. She talks about the rent prices, which she touches on a lot later in the book as well, and things like the difference between having contract workers at Google and the full-time workers at Google and the way that they were treated entirely different. And she only briefly touches on this at this point, but it's worth mentioning as it's kind of building on into later things in the book. So eventually after this, Wendy gets a job offer at Google and she doesn't take it. Her journey takes her to the startup world. She decides to start a startup with her and 3 other friends, I think her boyfriend and 2 friends, and they get involved in the startup grind. So at this point in the book, Wendy starts to tell her story as a startup founder, and it's not as glamorous as you might think. There's a lot of hard work that goes into it, and basically the idea is they're trying to turn their business into something that gets investments and they can sell off eventually as well and make millions. And there's a lot of infrastructure based around this startup system. So Wendy and her boyfriend and 2 friends that started the startup end up going to New York, basically because they have an offer to work in a place that is supporting their startup. So over a few years, their actual startup business model seemed to change. They were trying to find the thing that would work, and nothing seemed to be working. At points, they were focusing on data and selling and monetizing data. So she talked about how at that point the morality of selling and collecting data was not being questioned. This was pre-Cambridge Analytica, which brought a lot of attention to the idea and the moral implications of collecting a lot of customer data and selling it to different conglomerates and companies that would use that data to target customers, things like that, which is obviously still something that's common today. Another focus at this point in the story is the idea of work for the sake of work. Basically, Wendy felt that anybody who didn't work as hard as her and her team was, beneath them in a way. She would almost judge other people for not working hard, and she actually looks back on that and doesn't like that mindset very much. And basically the idea of valuing work for the sake of work. So there ends up being some conflict amongst the 4 founders of her startup. She especially, and the other 2 founders, think the last one isn't putting enough effort in and working hard enough because he wouldn't do things like work every weekend. Keep in mind that they seem to be working some pretty insane hours at this point in the story as well, and throughout the startup life. So throughout her journey in trying to make this startup succeed, Wendy ends up questioning a lot of the things they're doing and the tech industry is doing. The idea that it's a public good and that the amount of money that's going to the technology sector in our economy, a lot of different things she starts to kind of wake up to, and that's the narrative in the book. The problem is that it just seems like she's all over the place. Like the book doesn't really have a clear focus. Yes, it's on the technology industry, but she kind of touches on everything. And at that point, she almost ends up focusing on nothing. It's just too much. So she has been overworking in this startup and starts to burn out. The idea of selling the company they've built and the software they've built for a huge sum of money kind of just starts to leave her mind. The dream starts to die, and she kind of just wants to get out. So what she ends up doing is going with one of the co-founders and also her boyfriend to the UK in order to study in a university. So at this point, she talks about how she just throws herself into reading and learning about all types of social and economic issues. It's very difficult for me to talk about this change in perspective and her new opinions on a lot of these things, because it's kind of all over the place. She kind of takes away from the strength of a lot of her points just by just not staying on one point long enough and going on and on and on. And so one of the things she talks about is the power of workers in this industry and the fact that they're basically seen as tools and not as human beings. And she sees that as kind of a broader problem in a lot of capitalistic tendencies. To boil it down very simply, the way I like to think about this point is she says that capital is more important than labor. And I actually very much agree with this point, and I think it's become a huge problem because capital doesn't really equate directly to basically the labor that's involved in creating the capital, and there's a huge discrepancy between the people that own capital and the labor needed to sustain that capital. Wendy also talks about this disparity in terms of the amount of money that is going into the tech industry and the capital involved, and she says that the current tech bubble is effectively drawing away resources from more socially useful endeavors. You have these companies focused on getting people to buy products in advertising, and a lot of this money is actually focused on getting rich people to buy products they don't need, because that's how you can make the most money, because they have the most money. She also discusses how basically wealthier people and people more privileged in society view their success. For example, the people that rise very far in Google and Facebook, and even the CEOs and CEO entrepreneurs of some of these huge tech companies like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk. And she says, if the economy is working for you, it's comforting to believe that your success came through your excelling within a reasonable system. Your success is deserved because you worked hard for it. And in fact, you deserve it more precisely because of all the hardship you faced. This is the natural ideology generated by a hierarchical system. Those on top are always led to believe that the system is fair and that they're on top because they deserve it. So I wanted to touch on this point very quickly because I think, yes, this is a very interesting individual psychological thing that happens. You know, when you get a job, you will attribute a lot of the success to your own work ethic and your own hard work. And it's not always true that that's the reason you got the job over somebody else, because it could be based on a ton of factors, socioeconomic factors, certain privileges that you've had in your education growing up. But at the same time, I think she takes this point to an extreme, because you can't say that you don't deserve the success at all either. As she points out that this is a natural ideology generated by a hierarchical system. And I don't understand what that means, because every system that we have is hierarchical. And I think it's absurd to think that you can have a system that isn't hierarchical. An example of her taking this a little bit too far was when she's talking about CEO entrepreneurs such as Musk and Bezos and Zuckerberg. She says their identity is based around, quote, being the good guy, making the world a better place, deserving their success. And that's fine, but then she says what they really want is to be loved. Okay. So now that Wendy's pointed out all of these problems and fundamental issues within our whole, technological, socioeconomic system, she presents us with solutions. And she presents us with a lot of solutions, but she also doesn't go into depth at all about these solutions. It does feel very idealistic, and I get the idea. Perhaps she's just trying to paint a picture of what a different kind of society could be like. I'll just give you a few examples. She said, we could have entrepreneurship as a public good. And she doesn't really do any explaining on that. Sure, it would be nice if everybody thought that, but how do we do that, She says, pitch decks and financials would be judged on the basis of practicality and social value rather than market domination. Okay. Are you getting everybody to change their perceptions? Are you changing human nature? Like, how are we doing that? She says we should institute a, quote, suitable structure enabling worker control of production. Yes, I think that's something we should work towards. How do we do it? She says, make it so, quote, it's no longer possible to become fabulously wealthy through entrepreneurship, quote. She just says all these things that I think generally most people could agree with, but it's not like we can just snap our fingers and change cultural perception. How about we, take one step at a time and account for some realities here. She says existing investment firms should be repurposed or replaced by new institutions. She doesn't talk about what institutions, replaced, how do we do that? What is the counter argument here? Just give us something to work with. I agree with a lot of what you're saying. Couldn't you have spent some of this time where you're touching on about 20 grand issues and kind of focused it down a little bit so we can kind of know where to go from here? So at the end of the book, she does try to make an effort to take all of these things she's talked about and boil them down to a more singular point. And that point, as I understood it, seemed to be that capitalism is the main cause of this problem. She says in the last chapter, capitalism is a disease and the venality of Silicon Valley is a morbid system. So capitalism is a disease. All right, that's great, but you haven't really supported that throughout this whole book. Yes, she does seem to have some good points about capital being an issue and the untruths associated with it, but at the same time, she talks about so much. And what about some of the positive qualities of capitalism? Don't just go from 0 to 100 there. What are you doing? In conclusion, as you can tell, I wasn't a huge fan of this book. I feel like it really doesn't know what it is. It tries to be a personal story of growth while at the same time touching on about 20 different issues society-wide and giving us solutions that are very vague. It just feels like there was a huge lack of editing going on here. The book is just rambling, and I even found 2 errors in the writing. On a positive note, she really does seem to have a knack for explaining things in a accurate and legible way. There were so many times where I was reading where I had to underline a sentence because it described a social issue or technology issue in a way that was really clear, and something, even if it was something I had been thinking about before, just gave me a new way to think about it in my head. And I really did enjoy that, and I think there's a lot of potential there. That's why I think with more editing, and it would be way better. And I do think that this is her first book, if I'm not mistaken. And so I would look forward to seeing more of Wendy Liu's work in the future. So I'm going to be giving this book a rating, and I'm going to give all future books that I read ratings as well. And it will be on a scale of 0 to 5. 0 being very awful and 5 being an amazing read. This book I would have to give a 2 out of 5. And that brings us to the end. Thank you very much for watching. And I do hope this brought you something valuable or at least interesting. If so, please leave a like or comment on the video and have a wonderful day.